Today we'll be talking about the maxillary and mandibular first and second premolars. In the FDI numbering system, the upper right first and second premolars are number 14 and number 15. Left maxillary is 24 and 25. Left mandibular is 34 and 35, and right mandibular is 44 and 45. First quadrant, second quadrant, third quadrant, fourth quadrant. The Palmer notation method is 4 and 5 for the upper right, 4 and 5 this way for the upper left, 4 and 5 this way for the lower left, and 4 and 5 this way for the lower right. The universal tooth numbering system, the numbers are 4, 5, 12, 13, 28, 29, and 20 and 21. For the maxillary first premolar, evidence of calcification is 1.5 years, eruption is 10 to 11 years, root completion 12 to 13 years. The mandibular first premolar, evidence of calcification is 1 3/4 to 2 years, eruption is 10 to 12 years, root completion is 12 to 13 years. On the maxillary second premolars, evidence of calcification is 2 to 2 1/4 years. Eruption is 10 to 12 years, and root completion is 12 to 14 years. On the mandibular second premolars, the evidence of calcification is 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 years. Eruption is 11 to 12 years, and root completion is 13 to 14 years. First, we will talk about the maxillary first premolar. The maxillary first premolar develops from 4 lobes. From the 4 lobes, 2 cusps form, a buccal cusp and a lingual cusp. The buccal cusp is longer than the lingual cusp by about 1 millimeter and is tilted distally from the midline. It is divided by the mesiobuccal developmental groove and the distobuccal developmental groove. The lingual cusp is shorter than the buccal cusp and is offset to the mesial of the midline. The lingual cusp is more pointed than the buccal cusp, but the buccal cusp is larger and longer overall. Both the buccal and lingual cusp tips are centered over their root. The cusp ridges of the buccal cusp have a longer mesial cusp ridge than the distal cusp ridge. This is significant for this tooth in that the mesial is longer than the distal. The mesial ridge is straighter also. Now, it can also sometimes be concave. From the facial view, the mesial border is very, very straight, whereas the distal border is more concave. The proximal contact points are at the junction of the occlusal and middle thirds of the tooth. The height of contour is on the buccal side and the cervical third, and the lingual side, the middle third. For the surface ridges, both the buccal cusp and the lingual cusp have 4 ridges, 1, 2, 3, and a triangular ridge. Each has a triangular ridge that runs from the cusp tip to the central groove. There's a long central groove and few supplemental grooves. These join, the 2 triangular ridges join at the central groove to form a long transverse ridge. The roots of the maxillary first premolar usually have two roots that separate and bifurcate at the apical third. There is a big mesial depression on the roots that join the big mesio-buccal developmental groove. There's a big mesial triangular fossa, and all of this combine, and this is very, very significant to this tooth. We're going to move on to the maxillary second premolar. The maxillary second premolar is similar to the maxillary first, except the distal and mesial cusp ridges of the buccal cusp are a little more equal in size, and the buccal cusp and the lingual cusp are also a little more equal in size. They're nearly the same length. Overall, though, they are shorter than the first premolar. There's no deep mesial marginal groove on this tooth like there is the first premolar. The distal surface, however, has a deeper root depression near the CEJ. On the occlusal surface, you still have your mesial developmental groove, your distal developmental groove, and you have your triangular ridge on your buccal cusp, your triangular ridge on your lingual cusp, and these form a transverse ridge across the central groove. On the second premolar, which is this tooth, there is not a long, the central groove is not as long as the first premolar, and there's lots of supplemental grooves coming from it. The root usually only has one root. Overall, this root is larger than the first premolar. The apex is blunt and tends to tip to the distal side. There's a longitudinal groove on the mesial and the distal of the roots only. Like I said, it's more on the distal, and the shallow root depressions on the mesial and distal and cervical third. Next, we move to the mandibular first premolar. Mandibular first premolars look like a canine. They are very significant in that they have huge buccal cusps and just a small lingual cusp. The lingual cusp is non-functional. It is afunctional. It is just there for looks. This is formed from 4 lobes as well, as were the previous teeth, and into 2 cusps, the buccal and the lingual. On the mandibular, it's different from the maxillary in that the distal cusp ridge of the buccal cusp is longer than the mesial cusp ridge of the buccal cusp. The buccal cusp is very sharp and well developed with a prominent buccal ridge. The tip of this cusp is centered over the root and is angled toward the lingual. You can tell it's angled toward the lingual. Developmental depressions are often seen between the 3 lobes of this cusp, but the developmental lines are not usually present. You can tell the lines are not there, but the depressions are. For the ridges, pits, and fossa, the marginal ridges are very, very well developed with a large triangular ridge on the buccal cusp and a small triangular ridge on the lingual cusp. The large triangular ridge on this buccal cusp can be seen from the lingual view. There are 2 depressions, one on either side of the lingual triangular ridge, right here and right here. It's called the mesial fossa and the distal fossa. This is very significant for this tooth because they're known as the snake eyes. These pits right here, the mesial pit and distal pit, known as snake eyes for this tooth. A significant groove of this tooth is also the mesiolingual developmental groove right here. it looks different than the distal side. This is this groove, and here is this huge mesiolingual developmental groove, which separates the mesial marginal ridge from the lingual cusp. The distal root rarely has a shallow developmental depression, as longitudinal grooves are not usually present. On the occasion that there is two roots, it's very rare. A deep longitudinal groove will separate the roots on the proximal sides. The mesial and distal surfaces of the roots are usually more convex. The mandibular first premolars are the only premolars that may have a transverse ridge that does not cross an occlusal developmental groove. It may not always have the central developmental groove. That's why. This tooth may or may not have a very well-developed central developmental groove. It has the transverse ridge, but not the central developmental groove. Last, we go to the mandibular second premolars. These are a very, very unusual tooth in that they can either be a two-cusp type or a three-cusp type, and they can form from either 4 or 5 lobes. Now, the one pictured here is the three-cusp type. There's a huge buccal cusp. This is all buccal. And then we have a mesiolingual cusp and a distolingual cusp. Now, on the three-cusp type, the mesiolingual cusp is usually wider and longer than the distolingual cusp, and it's also divided by a lingual groove. Now, if there's just the two-cusp type, there's going to be the buccal and a lingual, no separation, no lingual groove. The ridges are going to have the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal cusp ridges, and these are more rounded than on the first premolar. However, the marginal ridges right here are at a right angle to the long axis of the tooth. You can see that these marginal ridges are very, very straight. The distal marginal ridge is at a lower level than the mesial marginal ridge. You can see more of the occlusal surface on the distal side. Also, there is no mesiolingual developmental groove, as there was on the mandibular first. No mesiolingual developmental groove. Now, on the three-cusp form of the occlusal surface, each of the three cusps has a well-developed triangular ridge, separated by deep developmental grooves. The grooves form a wide pattern on the occlusal surface and form a Y. Here you go. There and there. The three developmental grooves are mesial, distal, and lingual. 3 pits may be present: central, mesial, and distal pits. Of the 3, the central pit is most likely to be present. The mesial and distal triangular fossa are also present. On the two-cusp type, the lingual surface of the crown is more convex. So it tapers lingually, and there's no developmental groove, like we said, present. Now on the two-cusp type, it will either be an H or a U. The three-cusp type is the Y. Now the roots are similar to the first premolar, but wider and longer. There's one root, no tendency to bifurcate, and there may be a distal longitudinal groove, or depression rather, in the middle, and there's less likely to be a developmental groove on the mesial side. Thank you for watching our video.